This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
A repeat appearance today by my guest, Christopher Ryan. He came on a few years back to discuss his bestseller, Sex at Dawn. Today we discuss Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. Inspired by his original research into sex at the prehistoric age, Chris now looks at us in the modern age. All of our civilization. We're so civilized. We've got everything figured out. Or do we? Or did perhaps prehistoric us a long time ago, did we have things figured out a little bit better back then? And has the description of our ancestors been put into a negative light to make us feel good about where we supposedly are today in our, quote, advanced civilization? My first interview with Chris is one of those episodes on this podcast that I can't forget because he addressed things, he brought up issues that were just memorable. It just sticks with me. So jumping right back into that headspace with a very interesting guest, a repeat performance, let's get right into Christopher Ryan and his new book, Civilized to Death. As I was thinking about this conversation, Chris, it made me recall our first conversation about your book, Sex at Dawn. And I've done 800 of these podcast episodes, probably 500 plus interviews, a lot of very interesting people that you know, I know, etc. But yours is one of these episodes that there's things that happened in talking with you that I can't forget. What is this world of yours that you bring up topics that, I mean, literally, there's not too many people in the world that have done 800 podcast episodes in the last 7 years, talking to everybody under the sun. And what is it about your content that causes, is it your content or is it me relating to your content that it imprints on my mind?
You're asking the wrong guy. I mean, I think there's something deeply relevant about the stuff that I'm writing about, whether it's sexuality or the way the modern world intersects with the world we evolved to live in. I'm definitely a generalist, so there are probably more opportunities for this material to interact with one's life than a lot of people who are much more focused and specialized.
Let me give you an opening salvo for your newest path, which I think is really interesting, taking your former path of Sex at Dawn and applying it to all aspects of life. I was thinking, okay, let's just take the imaginary 20-something American guy today. He looks at the landscape and he says, gosh, I want to be a VC, or I want to work on Wall Street, and I want to get the 50 million or the 100 million, and I want that big condo in New York City. Let's say he gets to there. A lot of time spent, a lot of sacrifices, friends, family, etc. Gets to that tower. Now he's got the money. Now he's feeling good. Look, I'll be the first person to say this is, I've done all right. Okay, I'm not criticizing money per se. But then a funny thing happens on the way to the goal. Then you get there and you're like, okay, I'm on the 50th floor of this tower in New York City looking down. Maybe I'm by myself. I've got all this money. Do I really need to exercise now? The good life is all about just sitting around and drinking gin and scotch or something at some fancy bar. I mean, you can see where I'm going with this. It's like all the things that we've laid out in society as the path, the direction, etc. If you get there, is it all that? When you do get there, is the guy that's made the 100 million, isn't his real objective to go escape and get a quiet life somewhere that's really peaceful and easy, which is where you could have started with to begin with?
Yeah, that's the conundrum. You've probably heard that there's a parable about the Mexican fisherman who's got his little boat and he comes in with the fish and he sells it to a wealthy American businessman who's down in Mexico on vacation. And the businessman says, man, you should raise some capital and buy some more boats. And the Mexican's like, why would I do that? And he says, well, because then you could employ people and they could go out and do all this fishing, and then you could sell the fish at a markup and you'd have this source of passive income and you'd be all set. And the Mexican says, why would I do that? And he says, well, then you'd have a lot of free time. And the Mexican says, yeah, but what would I do in my free time? I like to fish. It's that circular sort of logic. We're working really hard to try to get to the place where we started, which is Joseph Campbell's thesis in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that every society has the origin myth of the person who leaves home and goes out and has all these experiences and faces challenges and so on. And then they take the knowledge that they've learned and they go back home. I think our species is doing that on a macro level, but I think on a micro level, we do it as well. Many individual lives feel like a spiral where you sort of return to some of the values and principles and experiences that you started with, but now you're experiencing them as an adult. But yeah, I think there's, in a society that gives us false information about what success means, I think that people often find that they've sacrificed a lot of time and energy in order to achieve something that doesn't actually exist. What's the line about midlife crises? That it's when you get to the top of the ladder and realize it's up against the wrong wall?
Yeah, for sure. Just as a quick reminder to you, because I'll bring it up today, I've had this interesting experience in a good portion of my 40s now into my 50s, where I spent the last 7 years mostly in Vietnam. That's been, to look at your work opens up for me so many things that I've seen, because while yes, it's a culture with very modern people and modern conveniences and stuff, but they're very traditionally rooted. They're still attached to these traditional ways. And even something as simple, let's just jump into a really interesting topic that harkens back to your first book. Even if I look at women, for example, in Vietnam, you can clearly see that puberty is not happening at 12 years old. Now, this is not a weird statement for me. It's just an observation. And I've got plenty of women friends and yoga classes, and I'll talk to them, and they all talk about a late maturation cycle. Why don't you open up that Pandora's box right out of the gate? Because you're always the fun guy to bring the controversial stuff to the table.
Well, what aspect of it do you want to get into? You want to talk about?
I think the menstruation thing is really interesting.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I think what you're hinting at is a section in the book where I talk about the fact that hunter-gatherer girls didn't begin to ovulate and menstruate until probably 16, 17 years of age on average. And this is due to the fact that there were very few estrogenic compounds in the primordial diet. In the modern world, we have all sorts of things that trigger early ovulation in girls. Also from the fact that hunter-gatherer women have very low body fat content, which is another thing that triggers early fertility. So you have girls who start to menstruate at 16 or 17. Now, they've typically been having sex for several years, so they're sort of natural birth control in that respect. And then they will get pregnant and they'll have a baby and they'll lactate, they'll breastfeed for 4.5 years on average. So when you add the 9 months of pregnancy to the 4 years of breastfeeding, because of the low body fat content, hunter-gatherer women don't ovulate while they're breastfeeding. We see this in modern women as well, but it sort of depends on diet and so on. It's called lactational amenorrhagia, I think is the pronunciation. So they can't get pregnant during those years. And then they'll stop, the baby will be weaned, a year or two passes, they get pregnant again, and the cycle continues. When you spread that out over a lifetime from first ovulation to menstruation in the late 40s to mid 50s, what you find is that hunter-gatherer women menstruate around a quarter as often as modern women do. Modern women's bodies are going through that hormonal surge 4 times as often as their bodies are actually designed to do. Researchers are concluding that this may be an important factor in breast and ovarian cancer because of this assault on women's bodies at a much higher rate than is natural.
Now, what's so great about, I think this also gets to why I like your topic areas and what you're trying to get into, because I think it's ultimately what we're all trying to understand about ourselves. But what you just described,
I really don't see how anybody on the quote left or the right is going to disagree. You're just kind of putting out for everyone to understand deeper issues. This is what we're missing in society so much. Is like you're putting issues on the table. We don't hear this in modern society. We don't hear this as a modern debate. I'm sure some people could think, oh my gosh, it's these two guys talking about this controversial issue. But I think we're doing it respectfully, and we're bringing it up and we're pointing out. Now, then we got to think about what's the ramifications of this. If the great modern civilization is where we all should be, and we're looking back, as you do, to the forager societies, what does this mean if women's bodies are going through all this stress in the modern world? How does that play out and extend?
I think it's a particularly powerful example of something that I'm trying to point out in the book in a more general sense, which is that anytime there's a mismatch between the sort of life that we've evolved to live and the life we actually do live, that mismatch or that point of conflict generates trauma. It can be physiological trauma that can be expressed as higher rates of cancer or heart disease or hypertension or diabetes or a whole host of so-called diseases of civilization. Obesity, malnutrition. I read the other day, the latest WHO report says that 1/3 of all children in the world are malnourished, including those who are obese and those who are underweight for their age because of nutritional deficiencies. Anywhere that we have these points of conflict between what the body expects and what it actually receives, you have trauma, you have disease, you have disorders of various kinds. And I think that the same applies to our psychological and emotional health, where we are living in ways that don't conform with what our being expects. We have problems. 25% of Americans are living alone right now. That's the highest rate ever. And it's tragic. It's killing people. I have a friend who's a fireman in Portland, Oregon, and I asked him what the worst things that he sees are. And this is the guy who arrives at traffic accidents and suicides and all sorts of horrible places and situations. And he said that the worst thing he sees, which is also the most common thing he sees, is isolation, social isolation, people who are so lonely that they'll call the fire department just to have someone to talk to. That's another example of how the modern world is out of step with the world that we've evolved to occupy. That's why I wrote the book. Civilized to Death it's not so much about the individual examples. What I'm trying to offer the reader is a way to look at their lives through the lens of prehistory in order to see more clearly why some things aren't working for them. The executive that you mentioned who works really hard to make a lot of money, there's a whole section in the book about wealthy people who are miserable. One of the reasons they're miserable is that, in fact, wealth separates them from their community. The more wealth you have, the harder it is to be embedded in a community of people like you. One, because there are fewer people in that income bracket. Secondly, as your income goes higher, it's harder to trust people. It's harder to know their motivations. Everybody seems to have an agenda. They want to get you to invest in their company or give you some advice or help them with this or that. Any kind of separation from community is very difficult for us to process, whether you're separated by wealth or by poverty. It's the separation itself that's so traumatic for our species. In fact, it's the punishment that we reserve for the worst criminals, solitary confinement. It's worse than being in with the murderers and the rapists.
Yeah, such a great thought. I was just thinking about your isolation comment. If somebody is listening and they say, oh, that's over-exaggeration. You know what? Go to your local post office, specifically in America, perhaps other countries. Go to your local post office, go to your local bank, and just observe the people in the lines. It's older people who are lonely. 100% every day. And when they go to the counter, watch them at the counter. They take so much time. They want to interact. They want to talk. Everything is pronounced because they don't want to leave because they have the isolation. And this is one of the few connections they maybe know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And you mentioned Vietnam. I was in Vietnam for 3 months. One of the things I noticed is much less of that sort of isolation. Old people are venerated. They're an important part of the family. In the United States, they're unproductive and unimportant and shunted off into homes or living alone on their own. The values of modern society are, again, totally out of alignment with what makes life meaningful and healthy for us as a species. I think it's time that we really re-examine this notion of progress and look a little more deeply at the proclamations of how wonderful life is and how we've been progressing for thousands of years and things are getting better and better and better. I think it's certainly true that technology is progressing, but to what extent that technological progress translates into higher quality of living is, I think, at least a question that's worth asking in a serious way. I leave it to people to come to their own conclusions, of course. I start the book by saying that your life may have been saved by a medical procedure that wouldn't have existed 20 years ago or 100 years ago. And so it's obviously very difficult to say, oh, yeah, this is all a mistake. But if you look more closely at the situation, it's quite likely that whatever it was that medical procedure saved you from wasn't a problem for prehistoric people. It wasn't a problem until civilization created the problem. One of the most common responses I get from people is, oh, what about vaccines and antibiotics? And thank God we have these things. True, thank God we have these things, but hunter-gatherers didn't have to deal with the diseases that those things are protecting us from, partially. There was no cholera, there was no smallpox, there was no tuberculosis, influenza. All these things are pathogens that jumped over from animals when we domesticated pigs and chickens and cattle, and we're living in close proximity to them. Most of the things that these modern marvels protect us from are dangers that only were created by civilization in the first place.
I'm holding this fine new book in my hands, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. You just told me that you're leaving it to our own conclusions, but on the front cover of this book is a monkey. Okay, it's a monkey with a hamburger, wearing a suit with a Coke, with an iPhone in his hands, staring out towards me, looking very concerned and worried. So I'm not sure how much this is being left to my own conclusions.
Yeah, you got me there. That cover was actually designed by a guy who listens to my podcast. He sent it to me a few years ago after listening to me talk about some of the themes in the book that I was writing at that time. He just said, yeah, I was listening to you and I sketched this out. And I said, man, can I make some T-shirts, print this on T-shirts and send you some money? And he said, sure. And so we worked out a thing and I started selling those My mom actually sells the T-shirts from her garage. People love them. We've sold thousands of them. I might be the only author who was selling T-shirts years before the book came out. When the book was ready and talked to the publishers, they had ideas for the cover. And I said, you got to let me use this, the sad chimp. I mean, people love this image. And I even showed them there's a guy who had it tattooed on his leg. That image seems to speak to people. So I'm glad it found its way to the cover of the book.
It's great. It's great. Let me keep it. I introduced a topic with women, and let me keep it at women for a moment and expand it out to, let's just call the equality of the sexes. Something that perhaps in hunter-gatherer and foraging communities was not really debated or thought of because it just existed. Let me keep it at, before I let you comment, let me keep it at my observation of a place like Vietnam. I'm sure some people on my podcast say, Mike, shut up. But it is this interesting petri dish of things. If you observe a place like Vietnam, modern Vietnam, you will see women, one of the highest labor participation percentages in Asia, very high, but their first billionaire, self-made woman. Again, we're not saying being a billionaire is all that, whatever, but it just shows that, okay, if you observe manual labor, let's say out on the street where they're doing some road work, you very likely could see 3 women and 3 men working together. It's really interesting. You would never see that in the States. It is something where, for me, I've had the chance to observe it firsthand. And then when I think back to watching the States, we've created a very different atmosphere. Why don't you go back in time and kind of educate us all as to what we were doing in prehistory before we got to this new modern world?
Well, in hunter-gatherer societies, women enjoy a very high status, generally equal to that of men, in terms of personal autonomy, in terms of what they choose to do with their time. In fact, hunter-gatherer societies are described by anthropologists as fiercely egalitarian, meaning no one really allows anyone else to tell them what to do. Decisions are made by consensus, and you can opt out of whatever it is you don't feel like doing. You can always join a different band. They're known as fission fusion social organizations. Bands come together and separate. People move between different bands at will. Everyone knows how to access the resources. Everyone knows where the food is, how to build a shelter, how to gather, how to hunt. Of course, some are better at different tasks than others, but everyone knows how to get what they need. Because you can't block anyone's access to the necessities of life, you really find that there's virtually no coercive power being exercised in these bands. In other words, no one's forcing anyone else to do something against their will, which is one of the reasons that most hunter-gatherer languages have no word for work. They don't understand the concept of doing something they don't want to do. When someone goes hunting, it's because they want to. Someone goes gathering fruits, it's because they want to. They're hungry and they want to contribute to the group. It's rewarding behavior. The things that anthropologists measure when they're trying to figure out how many hours per week foragers work, in air quotes, are things that we do on vacation, hunting, fishing, picnicking, and so on. This is as close to work as you get there. Women's status is quite high. It wasn't until the advent of agriculture that women became possessions of men. That was the first time, in fact, that our ancestors had possessions really of any sort and a concept of private property. When you're in a nomadic foraging group, you don't really want to have a lot because you have to carry it around with you. And the environment provides what you need as far as tools for weapons or for hunting, building shelter, and so on. So you don't carry things. There's no accumulated wealth, no accumulated food. That's by definition, hunter-gatherers don't collect and keep food. They keep moving and find the food in their environment. The status of women is quite high. With the advent of agriculture, women became essentially domesticated animals and possessions of men. If you read that line in the Old Testament, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, which I always thought was an admonition to respect your neighbor's marriage. If you read it in context, what it says is thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his house, nor his ox, nor his slave, etc. The wife is just another piece of property that belongs to your neighbor that you should keep your hands off. So it's a radical change in the relationship between men and women that occurred when our ancestors shifted from foraging to agriculture.
Somebody might be saying, Chris, Mike, okay, this is interesting. Why is it relevant to me? And my first thought would be, hold on. I mean, what's the divorce rate? What is going on? I mean, relationships are a basket case. The respect, the whole idea of getting along, things are at wit's end. As you lay out in the very early stages of your work, everyone knows, and this is just very big picture, everyone knows that something's not right in modern society, but no one really wants to talk about what's not right. And I guess that's why I so enjoy digging into a subject like this with you.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think people want to talk about it if they can, but they don't have the language for it because we're so steeped in this propaganda, this pro-civilizational propaganda. As I lay out in Civilized to Death, it's two-pronged. On one side, you're being told civilization is the greatest thing that's ever happened. Any discontent you must feel is your own damn fault, and you should just get over it because you're so lucky to be alive here and now. On the other hand, we're being told that where we came from, this life before the state, was a constant struggle for survival. It was miserable, horrible. Everyone was afraid all the time, being attacked by animals. We barely survived. The Hobbesian line about life before the state was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which was written in 1651, and it's still one of the most famous phrases in the English language. We've all heard it, nasty, brutish, and short. It's wrong on every count. Yet it's still a very powerful phrase because it reinforces this self-congratulatory rhetoric of civilization. Every social system has sort of built-in mechanisms for self-preservation, almost like a living thing, like a cell or an animal. Our society is no different. We're constantly told we're lucky, we should be content, we should consider ourselves fortunate to be here and just buckle down and do what you're told. So it's a deeply subversive message to say, wait a minute, is this really so great? If it's so great, when I was working on the book, or actually sort of thinking about working on the book, the comedian Louis C.K. was doing this bit where he's talking about being on an airplane and how we lose sight of the fact that it's just absolutely amazing that we're sitting in a chair in the sky. And rather than just being dumbfounded through the whole flight at how miraculous this is, we complain that our seat doesn't recline enough and the food's no good and this and that. And at the end of the bit, he says, these days, everything's amazing, but nobody's happy. I thought, man, that's exactly the book I want to write. If everything is truly so amazing, why are we so unhappy? Why are suicide rates up? Why is depression a worldwide epidemic and growing?
Why is everyone on meth and fentanyl and all this other stuff, right?
Antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Exactly. Clearly, we are not a happy species, whether you're looking at our psychological state, whether you're looking at rates of violence and mass shootings. And there was another one just down the road from me a few days ago. People are deeply discontent and deeply confused, and they don't know why, for the most part. And I think that one of the big sort of unidentified factors is simply that we are living in an environment for which we are not suited. So if people are saying, why is this relevant? I think it's relevant whether you're looking at your physical health, where you're looking at your sexual life, your community, your sense of belonging, any aspect of your life, this is relevant. I can't think of anything more relevant than this sort of discussion.
By the way, you mentioned that quote and you were talking about life being short. Why don't you address the life expectancy aspect of that? Because some wise people out there might be thinking, oh, Chris, but if you were in prehistory, you're probably dying at 30, and my grandmother lived to 95.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. And it's understandable because, again, like the Hobbesian nasty, brutish, and short, it's sort of a meme that's ubiquitous in society. I used to work in hospitals in Spain, and I was a guest lecturer in a medical anthropology class for a few years. This is something I would bring up with the students. These are medical students, and they were taught and they believed that the human body was only designed to last 35 or 40 years because that's when everyone died in prehistory. Of course, we get chronic back pains and our knees give out, and we have all these maladies of the second half of our lives because we're living twice as long as our bodies are designed for. That's not true. That's totally untrue. The reason we have this idea that people died in their 30s is that average life expectancy at birth is calculated. It includes infant mortality. And infant mortality in hunter-gatherer groups is quite high. Generally, between 30 and 40% of kids die before the age of 10. That's a big problem. There's no sugarcoating that. Now, a lot of those kids who die so young are kids who are born with physical abnormalities that would now be detected in prenatal testing. A lot of those fetuses would be aborted. Abortions clearly aren't included in our calculations of life expectancy. So there's some numerical hocus pocus going on there. But if you don't include infant mortality, if someone makes it past the age of 10 or so, they're going to very likely to live into their 70s, even into their 80s. Modal life at death for Homo sapiens is from 72 to 91 years of age. That's a species-specific estimate of how long we live in our natural state. That's a hunter-gatherer state. So the idea, like no human being has ever been old at the age of 35 other than Mark Zuckerberg. That's the only example I can think of. But everybody else, we don't get old until we're in our 70s and 80s.
Let's talk about an issue that I think is an interesting perspective, and that's the issue of leadership. I want you to go back and kind of lay out for the audience an understanding of leadership in prehistory. But first, I'd like to comment about leadership today. And when I say leadership, I think about the people that are above me that I have to, in some way, bow down to them for something. This could be a political leader. It could be a business leader. I mean, for example, if I do the wrong thing, I guess Mark or Jeff could kill me on Facebook or Amazon. If I do the wrong thing in U.S. politics, some senator, some president, somebody could throw me under the bridge, so to speak. This is a stressor that I think a lot of people feel where, gosh, I'm living under something that just feels like there's powerful people above me pushing down.
There's lots of weights in modern society pushing on people, but that's definitely one. Now, before, perhaps back in the day, it didn't work like that because a leader kind of had to earn their bread every day, didn't they?
Yeah, the whole concept of leadership is sort of flipped on its head when you look at prehistory, as is the concept of power. Leadership, for example, is someone who declares that they want to be a leader, someone who starts walking around saying, I should be the leader, I'm the boss, everyone should follow me. That person is immediately disqualified from any position of leadership because they've made themselves ridiculous. A quality of leadership is humility. That's one of the principal qualities of leadership in hunter-gatherer groups, along with generosity. It's the opposite of the situation we're in now, where someone accumulates resources, hoards resources, becomes wealthy, powerful, and then converts that wealth into political power, like Mike Bloomberg is attempting to do, apparently. It's the opposite of that. Someone becomes a leader in a hunter-gatherer group simply because other people value their opinion. You become a leader because other people want you to be a leader, not because you want to be the leader, if you follow me.
There's a leadership example issue there too. If you are in the group and you are perhaps innovating or providing in a way where other people are benefiting, that can get rewarded just naturally as, oh, we kind of look up to you. You're bringing something to the table that we didn't all have.
Sure. You've demonstrated good judgment. That's the quality of leadership. When we're trying to decide where we should go to hunt in the winter, well, if you've been right the last 3 years when you made a suggestion, we wanted to go to the coast and you said, I think it's going to be windy on the coast. And we went anyway, and you were right. It was windy. Well, maybe next year we're going to consult you and your opinion's going to carry more weight. It's just this sort of natural, spontaneous accumulation of respect for having been right, or as you say, for having perhaps innovated or been especially generous or kind or shown some sort of wisdom that's unusual. These are the things that are valued, and this is how someone finds themselves in a position of leadership. The other thing that's worth saying is that, like just about everything else in hunter-gatherer life, leadership is dispersed. You might be someone whose opinion is particularly valuable in terms of where we go to hunt, but when it comes to how to deal with a problematic child, or how to deal with an illness or something in the spiritual realm, other people's opinion may carry much more weight because they've demonstrated a facility in that area. When you have these sort of contacts between Europeans and hunter-gatherer people in the Western Hemisphere, for example, the Europeans who are accustomed to this hierarchical, vertical political organization say, take us to your leader. The native people don't really know what they're talking about because they don't have a leader per se. Even the so-called chiefs that we associate with Native Americans, Sitting Bull and Geronimo and Red Cloud, these figures from the Wild West, those were war chiefs of the Lakota, of the Sitting Bull and Red Cloud, for example. They weren't the leader overall of the group. They weren't the people who made decisions on where to camp or where to hunt or how to deal with illnesses and so on. They simply were the people that were most respected in terms of organizing for war and how to deal with military issues. We call them chiefs, but within that culture, they would have been one of several different leaders, and each with a different contextual role to play.
As I'm looking at your book, I'm looking at that subtitle, The Price of Progress, and I want to shift it to an issue that I find interesting, and perhaps it's a hack that I doubt anybody else will bring up with you in an interview. But as somebody who likes to live in big cities, not necessarily, I think it's more for the social interaction. I mean, I can understand going through your work, the negatives, and I can see the negatives to big cities, but I enjoy the social aspect versus the isolation that you can find in, for example, a USA suburb. But something else that in terms of this kind of information flow in the modern age, I have really found enjoyment being in a place where I don't understand the language and I can't read the signs.
I hear that. Yeah.
You can run with that, but I mean, we don't think about in modern life how much we're being inundated with useless information. Whereas you could just find quiet enjoyment or write something or sing something or whatever, we're constantly being distracted and disturbed from a continuous thought by nonstop information. I want everyone to imagine if you were walking down the street for months and months and months and you did not know what the signs said, how would you feel?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've experienced a lot of that in my life. I've traveled extensively in countries where I didn't understand the language. I lived in Spain for 22 years or so. I do speak Spanish, but it's interesting that if I'm sitting in a restaurant, for example, and people at the next table are having a conversation, if I don't focus on what they're saying, I don't hear it. I didn't notice that until I was in the States and people at the next table were having a conversation. And whether I wanted to or not, I understood everything they said. There wasn't that choice. And I certainly felt when I was living in Spain that, okay, local politics don't really matter to me. Local holidays, I'm not really included. I don't need to deal with all this stuff. There's this wonderful, being an expat, there's this wonderful freedom where you're sort of falling in the cracks between the two cultures, which, yeah, I really enjoy that. It's something I miss being back in the States. That sort of separation can be very liberating because, as you say, we're inundated in this social media environment. I can feel my own attention span contracting over the last 10 years or so with the Twitter and the Instagram. And I used to read books. I don't even have time to read magazines anymore. I don't know where it goes, but I'm sure it's going into a screen. I'm going to be in Asia this winter for a few months, and that's one of the things I'm really looking forward to is not understanding what's going on around me enough to find that peace and solitude and focus.
To shift it again, though, on you, you've got some criticism in your work of a guy that a lot of people will know of, Richard Dawkins. Why don't you paint the picture on how Dawkins started to come to the top of your mind as presenting imagery and thoughts that, I mean, look, we could talk about this in a second. I mean, optimism is another issue of the modern world, but why don't you go into Dawkins and kind of explain to the audience why a criticism of him was important in this work?
Well, I think that Dawkins is a brilliant scientist and his work is very valuable. But the aspect of it that I took exception to in the book is he's one of the leading voices, Dawkins, Pinker, Matt Ridley. These people are leading proponents of the neo-Hobbesian vision of prehistory, which is, and of the natural world in general. So the idea there is that they promote this vision of the natural world being one of ruthless competition, red in tooth and claw, dog eat dog, everyone out for himself.
The selfish rebel.
Well, there's the selfish infiltrator, right, which is a sort of a game theory explanation that they propose for why our ancestors could not possibly have lived in this Rousseauian paradise that hippies like me propose of equality and mutual respect and cooperation, despite the fact that, by the way, the anthropological data is overwhelming in favor of this vision of prehistory because this is how modern hunter-gatherers live. And they live in the same relation to the natural world as our ancestors. So it's not a big leap to say that contemporary hunter-gatherers in the Amazon and the Inuit in the Arctic and the Australian outback, they all share these social characteristics. Well, to extrapolate that to our prehistoric ancestors is very logical and solid. But in their case, they say we couldn't possibly have lived that way because some selfish person would have arisen from within the group or infiltrated from outside the group. And that selfish person who just sort of laid back and took more than his share and didn't contribute would eventually flourish and have lots of kids because that selfishness would be good for him on an individual level. He'd be having sex with women and taking food and not working, and eventually that mentality would take over the group. What you find in hunter-gatherers, though, is that someone who behaves that way is subjected to consistent and nearly, well, they are universal social mechanisms, starting out with ridicule. You would start joking about, oh, yeah, Michael thinks he's a big shot. Yeah, he killed a deer, and now everyone has to bow down to Big Michael. You'd get all this kind of ridicule. And if that didn't work, then someone might take him aside and say, hey, listen, people are starting to talk about you. You're getting a little out of line here. You got to calm down. If these things don't work, you have to remember everyone's armed in a hunter-gatherer group. Everyone knows how to use those weapons for hunting. A hunting accident can happen very easily at any time to someone who becomes too disruptive to the group. So the selfish infiltrator isn't realistic. It's a game theory approach to social interaction that doesn't find any replication in the literature.
One big picture that you raise, and you use an example, I believe it's at an Indonesian zoo with orangutans. You contrast it with the San Diego Zoo. I'm going to let you run with all this, but it also got me thinking of the old Twilight Zone episode with Roddy McDowall where he goes to Mars. The Martians are nice to him. The next thing he knows, he's in a nice little house. He thinks it's wonderful. Then he can't get out of the house and he realizes there's bars and he's in a zoo and all the Martians are staring at him. In many ways, I think that's ultimately, and I want you to outline the Indonesia/San Diego orangutan example, but I feel like we're in a human zoo. People aren't pondering that enough, that what we are in the modern world is a human zoo. To me, there's just no way around that. Am I crazy?
Well, no. If a zoo is an artificial environment, then yeah, we're all in a zoo. Desmond Morris wrote a book called The Human Zoo, I think in the 60s, one of the first sort of popular anthropology books. There's no doubt that we live in an artificially created environment. You're sitting in a room right now with temperature control, and so am I, and lots of right angles and artificial plastics and fumes and God knows what else. The question is, what kind of zoo do we want to live in? I tell the story about a long time ago. I was backpacking through Indonesia, and I was on the island of Sumatra. I was in Bukittinggi, and I went to the zoo there, and it was so depressing. It was just a 5, 6, 10, I don't remember how many cages, concrete cages with orangutans sitting inside these little cells. And the orangutans were just so desperate and lost and depressed. And yeah, it was traumatic. And then I didn't go to a zoo again for years until I was working on Sex at Dawn, my first book. I was invited to the San Diego Zoo to observe the bonobos who were housed there. Wow, the San Diego Zoo, the environment is designed with an understanding and respect for the animal that's housed there. It's still a zoo, it's still an artificial world, but they design it with intelligence and to replicate the natural world of that animal. Social, environmental, the food it eats. Are there trees to climb or not? Is there a water source? How much space do they need to be comfortable? What I'm calling for in Civilized to Death is that we bring that same sort of respect and knowledge and consideration to ourselves in designing the zoo we live in, because we are the only animal that lives in a zoo of its own design. In order to do that, what we need, the first step, I think, is to have a more accurate sense of the world in which we evolved, in our, what is our home? What is natural to us as a species? It's a far cry from the world most of us are living in right now.
If I ponder the future for a moment, and I think about the trajectory that we're on, now somebody out there, before I even go to there, they might be saying, oh, these are just some interesting examples, Chris and Mike, and you're having a nice conversation, and wow, this is really amazing. But hey, the modern world is just zooming along. My counter would be, well, hold on, if it's just zooming along so swimmingly, okay, if we had all this modern progression and we were thin, if we weren't addicted to drugs, if we had good relationships, there wasn't this massive depression and unhappiness, I'd be like, okay, but that's clearly part of the modern world. There does seem to be, and I think we all know this deep down, if we look at all these maladies across the spectrum, this goes wrong at some point in time. At some point in time, something breaks in some way.
Yeah, there are snaps in individual people when someone reaches a tipping point and they tip into terminal cancer or diabetes or whatever finally brings down the body. There are snaps psychologically when someone becomes suicidal and too depressed to function. I think there are also tipping points on a more global scale that we're clearly approaching environmentally. We have fisheries collapsing. We have ocean currents that seem to be slowing down and are in danger of stopping, which is going to throw all sorts of interesting weather patterns into the mix. But I think also, I quote a book, I cite a book quite a bit in Civilized to Death called A Brief History of Progress by Ronald Wright. It's a fantastic book, very powerful, and it is brief. It's probably 150 pages, but he sort of looks at every civilization that has existed in the history of the world. And he shows that they all go through the same sort of life cycle. You can recognize the periods of rise and at their heyday, and then how they start to be corrupted, and they behave the same ways. Every civilization that's ever existed has collapsed without exception. There's no reason to think that ours is any different. Why would it be different? The only difference is that when ours collapses, it's going to be global, as opposed to the previous ones, which have been regional. Something's going to snap for sure, because something always does snap. If you read that book and you look at Western civilization, you can clearly see that we're in the decline right now. We've peaked. We've got our Caligula in office, and we're starting to, the decay is apparent. We're in incredible debt, both financially and environmentally. We're living on oil. We're eating oil. Our soil is so depleted that if we weren't pumping oil-based fertilizers into it, we wouldn't have anywhere near enough food. Yeah, something is going to snap, and it's probably already snapping even as we speak.
By the way, so just to make sure my audience on the right also feels like they've got a stake in this, I think you could have easily said, from their perspective, that if Hillary was in office, you could have said Caligula in office with her too. So I think you could go both ways on the political spectrum. That ultimately, I think if the bread and circus stuff, I mean, if you really look at modern America right now, what has become the fascination where people are putting their energy and time into this political debate, this tribal political debate, which it's nothing more than mental masturbation. I mean, it is not progressing any of us forward. There is never going to be a resolution. There's not going to be a resolution because the powers that be don't want a resolution because they're making money from no resolution. But they've got everybody seduced into thinking this is an important thing for their life. Whereas I would argue that the book that I'm looking at right now with the chimp on the cover is much more important to having a happier life than worrying about whether or not somebody on this side or that side screams something particularly louder at that moment in time.
Yeah, there's even a question of whether there are sides. I love the Frank Zappa quote about this where he says, politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. Like you said, it's bread and circuses. It's theater to keep us distracted from what's really going on. I think there's an added component to it now, which we see in this epidemic of online rage and Twitter controversies and all this kind of stuff, which is I think that we're desperate for distraction because a lot of people, I think, can sense that we're in a very dangerous time, a time of decay and collapse. But we feel powerless because these are issues beyond our control to a large extent. So rather than focus on these global issues that are so depressing and difficult and intractable, we yell at each other about, it's like coming home from a job you hate and you kick your dog. It's not the dog's fault, but you can't kick your boss. So that's what you do. I think, yeah, both of those things are happening. As you say, it's not, I've known Trump since the 80s when I worked in commercial real estate in New York. So I have sort of a special feeling about him personally. But I think that you're absolutely right. The corruption is not on one side or the other of the political process. It's the entire process in the United States.
As we wind down, last night I was sitting at a dinner in Saigon, Vietnam. My parents visiting, along with my father's first cousin and her husband and my fiance. So we're sitting at a rooftop restaurant eating sushi in Saigon, overlooking the city, this massive place. I looked at them all, and they had just arrived in the last 24 to 48 hours. My parents had been to Saigon once before. The other couple had not been. I looked at them as they were just taking in everything from an entirely new environment, everything hitting them and knowing the feeling that they're going through, having lived it myself, but observing them. And I asked them a question. I said, hey, have any of you even thought about your prior life in the last 24 hours?
Yeah.
And we all get caught up in stuff. And that's your point. We get caught up in stuff, but the stuff is not important. What we want is the experience. What we want is just a nice feeling of just a certain peacefulness. The moment you kind of separate yourself from whatever you're in the middle of and just let it go and walk away, you're still alive. You don't die just by walking away from the insanity.
You're more alive than ever when you walk away from that. I spent about half the year in a van driving around the Western US and Canada. I call it my Vanthropology tour, where I go out and record podcasts with people and meet people who listen to the podcast and have these regional meetups where people can come and meet each other. And it's just fantastic. It's one of the best times in my life. I was with a friend this summer. We were driving around. We'd been on the road for a few months. I said, what do you miss? What do you miss that's back in your apartment? And the two of us thought, nothing. There's nothing. I'm paying rent to keep my stuff in a box, but I don't miss any of that stuff. I don't need any of that stuff. I don't even remember what that stuff is. You're right. Thoreau said a man's wealth is best measured by the things he can do without. I think that's true. I think conversely, our true wealth is in our relationships. The number one predictor of a long and meaningful and happy life is not how much you exercise or what your diet's like or whether you smoke or drink or whatever. The number one predictor is whether or not you feel that you are embedded in a community of people who have your back, people who love you and will protect you and take care of you. That is what predicts a long and happy life. I would argue that the reason that's such a strong predictor is that that's the kind of social world in which we evolve. And when we don't have that, we suffer, no matter how much we work out or count our calories.
Yeah, great perspective. I have to give you a slight dig. I was laughing as you talked about living in the van. I had a recollection of the old SNL sketch with Chris Farley, the guy living in the van down by the river.
Down by the river.
So I thought, okay, I got to come meet the guy down at the van by the river. So.
Yeah, I think I have a nicer van than that guy did. Like you can stand up in mine, and it's got a fridge and a nice sound system and all that.
That's a much different van.
But yeah.
The book, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. Great stuff, Chris. Where can we send people? Obviously Amazon, but where else can we send them? Another website?
Anyone can just go to my website, thatchrisryan.com, and they can find that book and previous books and my podcast and media appearances, and the whole shebang is there at thatchrisryan.com. And I'm also That Chris Ryan on Instagram and Twitter, so they can find me there being distracted.
Chris, thanks for taking the time. Please keep me posted on book number 3, 4. I don't know what's coming next. I know there's one coming next. There's always one coming next.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. My podcast is actually a bigger part of my life than writing these days. So we'll see how many more books come. But the podcast is what's called Tangentially Speaking. And I'd love to have you on if we ever find ourselves in the same city sometime. I only do them in person.
I'm coming to look for the van by the river.
All right.
Hey, listen, great stuff, Chris. I appreciate it again.
Thanks for talking, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.